Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today got a bit of a D&D video for you here. And realistically, this video will pretty much pertain to any type of setting you're doing that involves some type of world building. So realistically, this is going to be for any tabletop game that especially you're going to do world building with, but it's going to be more geared towards Dungeons and Dragons, if anything else. And that's because today I'm actually going to be discussing geopolitics and trying to give just a base, bare understanding of geopolitics. And the reason I'm even bringing this up is because, especially in the sense of Dungeons and Dragons, I think many game masters, or at least my impression of the people I have played with, is that many game masters kind of overlooks this when doing their map making. That they really don't consider where their rivers are located, where the terrain is located, the mountains, the forest, etc. And I really feel that it's a commonly overlooked thing is to look at the geopolitics, especially when one is shaping out the shape of their kingdoms, where their different cities and things of that nature is located. And I think that's actually kind of really important when it comes to your map creation in relation to Dungeons and Dragons or any other type of fantasy setting, especially medieval fantasy, because nowadays, because of technology, we can reach out all over the world much easier than ever before. Where back in the medieval period, it would be done through messengers and things of that nature. So communicating with a neighbor that's 100 miles away could be far more difficult because of the terrain that is in between point A and point B. But really quick, before I dive into today's video, the meat and potatoes, I just want to plug my YouTube really quick. Liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, things of that nature definitely helps out my channel. So that's always something I really appreciate. Also, if you want to provide additional support to the channel, I have a link for my Patreon down below. Go check it out. Doesn't really provide much, but it provides the channel some support and gives the channel some kind of budget. So it's just another one of those things that is greatly appreciated. Now let's get into what is geopolitics. And right here, essentially on the screen now, is a baseline definition of what geopolitics is. And essentially, I think it's much deeper than that, especially because of the geographical factors. When you look at different factors such as where your mountains are located, your rivers are located, your plains, etc., there's a lot more factors because that's going to increase or decrease the amount of power a king is going to have. So that's something that has to be taken into effect, is that essentially the terrain is the cause and the effect is how much power a ruler is going to have over his kingdom, no matter if it's through dukes, barons, or whatever else. It's also going to have an influence on how he communicates and essentially, how often he communicates different locations in his realm, but it's also going to have an influence on how your king and your royalty is going to communicate with their neighboring kingdoms, principalities, things of that nature, the duchies and the whole 9 yards. Because essentially, if there's a mountain between your king and his closest duke, there might actually be some failures in communication there, which could cause some problems, which could actually end up being interesting in the sense of a more political game, or a more political themed game within Dungeons and Dragons, where maybe the local duke is dissatisfied with his king because of various factors, and it could all be related due to the terrain and the geography. So essentially, everything from mountains to oceans to rivers is going to have some kind of effect on the geopolitics of your game. as well as even deserts and the plains themselves. And this is because it's going to essentially affect how people live and how people dress, their different types of beliefs, how they make a living, things of that nature. And essentially, that all is going to trickle back to the king. It's going to affect his influence, it's going to affect his wealth, and at the end of the day, it's going to affect his power. It's even realistically going to affect the infrastructure. As you can see here, you have a stone road. This is a great example. You have a nice stone road. Well, I wouldn't say so nice, but probably when this road was made, it was actually probably a fairly nice road, which was a fairly easy road for merchants and people to travel, and even military forces to travel. Now, of course, over time, the road is kind of a little beat up here and aged, but when it was built, imagine, if you will, a very nice road. To build this road, there would have been stone, when building this road, there would have been a lot of stone used, which is pretty obvious. In a region that doesn't have a lot of stone, this is not something that's going to happen. Now, if you actually take a time to look at your Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, there's actually information there about traveling along roads, particularly stone roads is actually in there, or paved roads, or yeah, I think it's just stone roads. I can't remember how it was worded. I think it was stone roads. And essentially, that is the fastest, easiest way of travel. That being said, stone roads like this are also going to be roads that more than commonly not is going to be patrolled somehow, which is also going to affect the king's influence and power. And essentially, it's going to or it's going to influence the local politics because the king can enforce his rule. So it's definitely going to affect the infrastructure itself. It's even going to affect things like if you have aqueducts. Now, other things that it's going to affect is also going to be the location. The geography is going to affect. God, English sometimes is going to affect where your ports are located, where your cities are going to be located, and most of all, where castles are going to be located, because essentially castles would typically be built around moats, if they could be built around moats, rivers, and definitely on high points in the local geography. So that is one important thing to think about whenever designing your Dungeons and Dragons map. Once again, too, this is also going to influence many things, especially ports. Also, with that being said, the infrastructure is going to have an effect on your resources, especially your mining resources. I would say that is definitely one important feature that's going to affect how the king can rule his land and even communicate and etc. with outsiders, especially with outside trade. Because if the local king is sitting on top of a gold mine, then obviously he's going to have a lot of wealth that he can use for trade. Now, obviously, if the king is greedy, that's going to change things, but whatever. And even things such as an iron mine is going to have some kind of effect on the politics. So essentially, your mines, they're going to be within mountains normally. Bing, bang, boom. That kind of explains how, once again, the geography is going to affect the influence. Because if he has iron and the people has a way to create steel, obviously that translates into possibly a powerful military that can once again enforce the king's rule. That could also have influence on if a king decides to go to war or not. Just a little snippet there on that end. Another thing that the terrain is going to have an effect on is the food, farming in particular. Farming and cattle raising are another one of those things that when you're thinking about your geopolitics, you're going to want to think about where your plains, your grasslands, and etc. is going to be set up at. And once again, that's going to have an effect on the king's rule, because obviously if the people are fat and happy, then they're fat and happy. However, if they're starving, then there's going to be a possibility of rebellions on hand. With that being said, too, if there's not much in the way of farmland, but there's a high population, then the king may have to use his resources, may it be steel, wood, coal, gold, etc., to trade for food so that way he can keep his people fat and happy. So there's a lot in the way of dealing with imports and exports as well. And that's going to boil down to there's going to be a lot of different factors to take in. First, I would say probably your most important within the infrastructure of the kingdom itself is rivers, because rivers is a good way of moving supplies short distances from point A to point B, such as maybe moving coal from a coal mine in the north of your kingdom down to a more southern part of your kingdom. More than likely that coal is going to be moved by a river because you can float a boat down a river. And that's going to affect how the supplies are transported, which could actually lead to adventures in itself, as well, there could be attacks along the rivers, and the heroes are tasked with finding out who is committing the attacks or even trying to protect said transports that is transporting supplies downriver to other parts of a kingdom. Now, when it comes to oceans with bigger ships, obviously your port locations is going to be important within your political influence because, well, that's how they're going to reach out to other lands. Other lands may have other stuff such as silk, different types of exotic foods, maybe higher quality iron or steel, gold, silver, diamonds, etc. So there's a lot of things there to factor in when it comes to your imports and exports and how things are being traveled around, distributed, and etc. And with that being said about ports, it's also going to have an effect on your military naval might within your kingdoms. And yeah, that's going to be a huge effect because essentially that's going to probably be the first line of offense or defense, no matter which way you look at it, for a kingdom, especially a kingdom that has a port. And kingdoms that may have things like, if your campaign set up like mine, where you do have gunpowder weapons, gunpowder within a kingdom could definitely have a major effect on how the Navy works, operates, and looks. Lumber is going to have a factor in here as well. Different types of things. Canvas and silk is going to have different effects. Hemp, because of rope, is going to have an effect. And that's all going to have an effect on the king's influence, is how much of these supplies he can have to be bundled up to build a navy to protect his kingdom. And of course, the more powerful his navy, the more influence he's going to have, because the more likely he will be able to invade other territory or defend his territory. So it's all a territorial process of how they control their land and what kind of effect it's going to have. And then even when you look at your standard militaries, it's also going to have effects on their types of equipment and even their tactics, because that is going to have an effect. A kingdom that has more steel at its disposal is probably going to be more than willing to build swords, especially long swords, well, arming swords, if you will, long swords by D&D terms, great swords, bastard swords, things of that nature, where a kingdom that has less steel may not be using steel weapons at all. They may be using iron weapons or bronze weapons, and that's going to be also the same case with armor. A kingdom with much more steel or iron available, they may use things such as steel or metal shields, where a kingdom that has less steel available may use some type of wooden or even wicker shields, if you've ever seen a wicker shield. Also, in the regard of looks of the military, a kingdom that's got a lot more flat land, a lot more plains, a lot more farmland, may be more reliant on some type of cavalry force as their primary force whenever going to war or whenever defending the kingdom for what that matters. If I remember correctly, if you look at Lord of the Rings, Gondor was mostly flat plains, and they relied very heavily on cavalry. Where, on the other hand, an area where the terrain is much more hilly and much more mountainous, they may have more supplies to build more or to have more heavy infantry at their disposal, and they may rely more on heavy infantry because essentially they're going to end up using the terrain as some kind of natural defense. Once again, this is all stuff that is going to affect a king's influence, and it's all realistically boils down to the type of terrain, the shaping of the terrain, etc. And even still, finally, well, not finally, but another point to make is it's also going to have an effect on both military and civilian supply. No matter if it's trade or if it's dealt with how the military moves its supplies around, of course, they're going to use wherever they can't use a river to move supplies, they're probably going to use wagons. And of course, those wagons are going to be pulled by horses or some other beast of burden, may it be donkeys, mules, etc. And that's going to have some type of effect of how the kingdom's military is going to go to war and what they're going to do during a war, especially for supplies. And of course, at the end of the day, once again, that influences a king's influence, or at least has an effect on the king's influence. So it is definitely all something to think about. I know these are really minor details, and these are just baseline things, and I keep hammering home about the king's influence. But that's essentially what geopolitics is. Now, finally, the last thing I do want to discuss really quickly is going to be religion, because it's also going to have an effect on the local religion. Now, I wouldn't say it's going to have a huge effect on religion, but just bear with me here. As you can see, this is actually a statue of Neptune, or a depiction of Neptune by a statue. And essentially, a city or a port that's close to the ocean is probably going to be more influenced by a type of god, water god, like Neptune, where the more land-based gods might not be worshipped as much, because basically people would believe that those gods would have less effect on their day-to-day life. Now, with that being said, just as a pitch here, if there's a certain religion that is going on some holy crusade or unholy crusade in the name of their god to spread their influence and power, they may be affected by the terrain because of mountains and things of that nature. It may be harder to access the essentially the areas that are more mountainous and more isolated, if you will. So terrain is also going to have an effect on isolation, and that's pretty much where I'm going to wrap up today's video on basically just kind of a baseline of geopolitics and all the effects that it has, and why you should spend more time looking at the geopolitics of your world when you are designing it, when you're creating your map and placing your kingdoms and where your cities are going to be, etc., etc. You should definitely look at your terrain very closely and decide how that terrain is going to shape the influence of your kingdom, principality, whatever you are looking at. But anyway, folks, hopefully that's a good baseline of geopolitics. This is probably a subject I'm going to dive into a little more detailed in the future. We'll see how things go. Anyway, folks, hopefully you all enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.